What would you do if a high-ranking officer walked right up to a soldier on foreign soil and barked, "Salute me now"? Would you obey? Would you question it? Or would you stand still, completely still, and let the silence speak louder than any salute ever could? That's exactly what happened on the steps of Buckingham Palace, in front of a crowd of stunned tourists, NATO officials, and security teams who didn't quite know whether to intervene or take notes. Hey folks, welcome back to Royal Guard, where we uncover the stories behind the posture, the silence, and the code that has held steady through war, diplomacy, and centuries of tradition. Today's story is not just about a confrontation between an American Marine and a British Royal Guard. It's about discipline, ego, protocol, and the moment one soldier's silent stance humbled an entire room without lifting a weapon, raising his voice, or even blinking. It started on a misty morning in London, the kind where the palace gardens glisten just enough to look painted. A sleek motorcade rolled through the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, flying the flags of an American military delegation visiting for a NATO Strategic Leadership Summit. Among them, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes of the United States Marine Corps. He stepped out like he owned the place. Medals polished, uniform razor-sharp, posture unshakable. To an untrained eye, he was a symbol of everything disciplined and elite. But almost immediately he made it clear, this was all show to him. "This pomp," he muttered to his colleague, "for what's essentially a glorified meeting." He didn't hide his impatience, nor his disdain for what he saw as theatrical pageantry, especially when his eyes landed on a single Royal Guard standing post in the iconic red tunic and bearskin hat. That man, Sergeant William Barrett, didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't show the faintest twitch of acknowledgement, which only seemed to provoke Hayes more. He broke from the delegation's carefully orchestrated path, walked straight toward Barrett, circling him like a lion sniffing for weakness. "This uniform," Hayes said, half admiring, half mocking, "looks great on postcards, but let's see how practical it is in combat." No response. The Royal Guard's eyes remained locked forward, not in defiance, but in something much harder to master, complete military bearing. Now here's where it gets interesting. Hayes wasn't just trying to poke fun. He was trying to make a point. To him, standing still wasn't discipline, it was stagnation. He believed real military strength came from adaptability, quick reaction, and tactical awareness. He called the Royal Guards mannequins. He claimed they were wasting combat-ready soldiers by placing them in decorative roles. And as he made these comments, Barrett didn't move a muscle. But let's pause right there, because this wasn't just a random guard who'd been handed a rifle and a red coat. Sergeant Barrett had completed 4 combat deployments. He'd served in joint operations with American Special Forces. He had earned the Military Cross for valor, an award given only in the most extraordinary circumstances. He'd extracted intelligence assets under enemy fire, and he'd been handpicked for palace duty, not in spite of his combat experience, but because of it. In the British military, ceremonial posts like this aren't decorative. They're reserved for the most disciplined, trustworthy soldiers, those with a proven ability to remain unshakable under extreme pressure. And that's exactly what Hayes was about to test, unknowingly. So before we dive deeper into what happened next, and trust me, it only escalates from here, let's take a moment to think. Is discipline about reacting fast? Or is it about knowing when not to react at all? Keep watching, because what happened next will change the way you look at silence, authority, and what real military honor looks like. As the delegation moved along the palace path, snapping photographs and exchanging diplomatic pleasantries, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes lingered behind, his eyes glued to Sergeant Barrett like a man trying to solve a riddle carved in stone. He didn't understand this kind of discipline. To him, a soldier not responding was a soldier not obeying. So he tested the waters again. He stepped directly into Barrett's line of sight, a violation of palace protocol. He circled once more, making sharp remarks about combat readiness, comparing American Marines to British mannequins. And then, in a tone loud enough for tourists to hear, he delivered what he thought was the final blow. "Tell me, Sergeant, have you ever actually seen combat? Or did they post you here because you look good in red? Gasps from the crowd. A quiet shuffle as palace security took note, not yet intervening but ready. And still, Barrett stood unmoving. Now, let's be honest. In any other setting, a base, a battlefield, a briefing room, Hayes's remarks might have gone unchallenged. He was, after all, a decorated Marine officer. But here, on royal grounds, something larger than individual rank was at play. See, what Hayes didn't realize was that the Queen's Guard isn't just a symbolic relic of empire. It's a fully operational unit of the British Army. Every man standing in red has undergone intense training, not just for combat, but for ceremonial perfection under public scrutiny. And Sergeant William Barrett wasn't chosen for his appearance. He was chosen for his control. Let's pause and break down why that matters. Here are 5 little-known facts about the Royal Guard that put things into perspective. They are active-duty soldiers. Every guard has combat training. Many have deployed overseas, including in Iraq and Afghanistan, often alongside NATO forces. Selection is an honor. Guards are handpicked from elite regiments. Not every soldier qualifies. It's not a break, it's a test of the highest order. Protocol is law. Breaking ceremonial bearing without cause is considered a breach of duty, but responding with minimum necessary action when provoked, that's mastery. They don't flinch because they train not to. Every movement is rehearsed until it becomes second nature. Mental endurance is as valued as physical readiness. Their silence speaks. Guards are trained to be the face of British resilience. They represent not just a military unit, but a monarchy, a nation, and a legacy. Now back to our scene. Hayes, sensing he hadn't gotten the reaction he wanted, decided to raise the stakes. He moved in again, this time brushing his hand against Barrett's rifle. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Even tourists unfamiliar with the rules knew one thing: you don't touch the guard. Ever. Barrett didn't move, not yet. Hayes leaned in, voice low but sharp. I am Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes, United States Marine Corps. This is a direct order. Salute me, now. For a beat, the palace fell silent. And then Barrett moved, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with the clean, choreographed precision of a man who knew the weight of every gesture. He reached up not to salute, but to gently remove Hayes's hand from his weapon. Then he spoke. Sir, you are in violation of standing orders regarding interaction with the Queen's Guard. His voice was crisp, calm, commanding. No hint of disrespect, just unwavering clarity. Physical contact with a guard or his equipment constitutes a Category B security infraction. While your rank commands appropriate respect within NATO allied forces, standing palace protocol establishes clear guidelines. My duty is to the Crown first, Lieutenant Colonel. That duty includes maintaining position and protocol, regardless of external military authority. And just like that, the entire atmosphere shifted. It was no longer Hayes who held the authority in that moment. It was Barrett, not because he shouted, not because he resisted, but because he knew his duty and followed it without flinching, ready for what happened next. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes didn't move right away. For the first time that morning, he seemed off balance. His jaw tightened. His chest rose as if preparing a retort. But before he could speak, another voice entered the scene, calm, even, and undeniably authoritative. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Captain Richard Wells, commander of the Royal Guard, approached with deliberate steps and the sort of steady tone that came from handling hundreds of situations. None quite like this one. I believe there may be some misunderstanding regarding protocol on palace grounds. Hayes snapped to attention. Your guard broke position to address me. He's not following procedure. Wells didn't flinch. On the contrary, sir. Sergeant Barrett responded precisely as instructed under Standing Order 157, paragraph 3. In the event of unauthorized physical contact or an immediate security concern, guards are permitted to take minimal necessary action and issue a verbal notice. He paused. It was a textbook response. Hayes stood motionless, not from discipline, but from disapproval. For a moment, you could sense the air thick with competing philosophies. One man raised in the fire of reactionary combat, another molded by centuries-old expectations of silent vigilance. But let's examine something deeper here. What was really clashing wasn't just American military pragmatism vs. British ceremonial tradition. It was two different interpretations of power. Hayes believed in control through action. Barrett demonstrated control through inaction. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, defines not just soldiers but nations. As Captain Wells and Colonel Hayes stepped aside to speak in private, Barrett resumed his post, posture unbroken, gaze unwavering. To onlookers, it was as if nothing had happened. But inside the palace, ripples had already begun to spread. Back among the American delegation, murmurs filled the air. Major Davis, who had earlier tried to rein Hayes in, now wore a mask of diplomatic calm, one that barely hid his frustration. Colonel Wilson, the senior American officer, approached quietly but firmly. "Lieutenant Colonel, the delegation is awaiting your return." His tone, not a request, even among his peers. Hayes was beginning to stand alone, and yet he still didn't seem to see it. "This is theater," Hayes muttered, just loud enough for Davis to hear. Bright red targets standing still while pretending it's discipline. But the room had shifted. The tourists who'd once admired his medals were now watching him with a different lens, and the British veterans in attendance, they weren't silent anymore. One elderly gentleman, blazer adorned with medals from his own time in service, spoke quietly to a group of curious Americans nearby. "That guard out there, Barrett, he served in Helmand Province, same hell as your Marines. Some of his unit fought alongside ours. Don't confuse stillness with softness." Back inside, Captain Wells offered context of his own, not in defense, but in clarity. "The guards you see today returned from combat deployment just 8 weeks ago. This ceremonial duty is not a break, it's an extension of service, a test of mental endurance, a reminder that discipline isn't just about action, it's about presence." Hayes's face remained carved in skepticism. "With respect, Captain, I've served for 3 decades. I've never met a soldier who refused a direct order from a superior." Wells gave a measured nod. "That's because Sergeant Barrett didn't refuse an order, he followed his highest one." Now pause with me here, let's absorb that. He followed his highest one. That's the difference between military reaction and military principle. It's the difference between chasing control and choosing composure. And this, my friends, is where our story turns. Because the man who thought he'd exposed a flaw in the British system was about to find himself exposed instead. As Hayes returned to the delegation, you could feel the gap growing between him and his peers. Not just physical distance, though several officers subtly stepped away, but something deeper. A kind of quiet disapproval that didn't need to be voiced. He still clung to his position. "Ceremonial fluff," he mumbled. "Outdated protocols parading as professionalism." But for all his bravado, Hayes now stood isolated, his rank intact, but his authority quietly questioned. Back at his post, Sergeant Barrett stood precisely as he had before, unaffected by the storm he'd just weathered. The same red coat, the same rifle, the same unwavering gaze. Only now, those who had once seen him as ornamental now saw him as essential. Colonel Wilson, the senior officer, approached Barrett briefly before departing. A simple nod. No words, but in military culture, that kind of gesture means more than a paragraph. It meant, "I saw what you did, and I respect it." And he wasn't alone. Several NATO officers followed suit, small acknowledgments, quiet, professional, intentional. But Hayes, still fuming. "Military readiness isn't about pageantry," he muttered as they neared the motorcade. "We train Marines to adapt, not to freeze like statues." It was then that an American general, silent until this moment, turned toward him. He spoke slowly, carefully. "Interesting perspective, Lieutenant Colonel, though I must say Sergeant Barrett adapted quite effectively to your challenge." Hayes blinked. "Sir." He resolved the situation, maintained protocol, kept the peace, all while under provocation from an allied officer. The general paused. "Tactical objective achieved, minimum force used. Sounds effective to me." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was clarifying. Hayes had walked onto that palace ground believing he was the standard, that his way was the way. But what he encountered was something harder to measure: restraint, poise, obedience to a deeper chain of command. That's the thing about the Royal Guard. They don't move when poked. They don't flinch when insulted. They don't react because their training teaches them something more powerful than reaction. They embody resolve. And that, perhaps, is what unsettled Hayes most. Not that Barrett wouldn't respond, but that he didn't need to. Now, here's where it all turns. As the motorcade pulled away from Buckingham Palace, Hayes stared stonily out the window, his reflection caught in the glass. His face showed a man unconvinced, still wrestling with what just happened. But then, something remarkable occurred. Just before the gates, the entire American delegation passed within view of Barrett's post one final time. And this time, one small moment changed everything. Barrett, still standing with military precision, ever so subtly turned his head just a fraction of an inch. His eyes didn't move. His posture held firm. But it was a deliberate, unmistakable acknowledgement not to Hayes but to Colonel Wilson. It was, in every way, a soldier's nod, a silent message that said, "I saw you. I heard you. I respect you too." And that's when Wilson, a man of few displays, did something no one expected. He turned slightly in his seat, looked out the window toward Barrett, and gave a crisp, unmistakable American military salute. Not for show, not for politics, but for honor. Hayes said nothing. His eyes followed the motion, his posture rigid, but for the first time all day he didn't offer a single remark. Why? Because in that single, silent exchange, he realized something. He hadn't been ignored. He'd been outclassed by a man who never moved, never shouted, never gave in. And that, my friends, is where the real power lies. They say the loudest voice in the room isn't always the one shouting. Sometimes, it's the one standing still, unmoved by provocation, steady under pressure, and anchored to a code that doesn't shift with ego or emotion. That day at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant William Barrett was that voice. But let's take a moment to truly understand who this man was, beyond the red coat and crisp salute. Born in the Midlands, raised in a modest household, Barrett joined the military not for glory, but for structure. He once told a colleague, "I don't like chaos. The uniform gives me something that never lies." He served with distinction across 4 deployments. In one particularly harrowing joint operation, his unit extracted intelligence personnel while under direct mortar fire and didn't lose a single man. American Special Forces later submitted commendations to Barrett's file, calling him a rock in the middle of a storm. But Barrett never sought attention. In fact, he preferred guard duty. Why? Because here, he once said, your enemy isn't holding a gun. It's impatience, it's pride. It's the temptation to react when you shouldn't. And that right there is what separates a soldier from a warrior of discipline. Now, in military circles, there are dozens of ways to measure strength. You've got reaction time, combat kills, speed, adaptability. But there's one measurement that gets overlooked in our modern age: composure under provocation. And that's where the Royal Guard shines like few others. Let's go deeper. Here are 5 traits of the Royal Guard that make them a rare breed in modern military tradition, and why Barrett's story embodies each one. 1. Absolute chain of command awareness. Royal Guards aren't confused about where their orders come from. On palace grounds, their commander isn't a visiting NATO general, it's the crown. This isn't arrogance, it's structure, and structure prevents chaos. 2. Emotional neutrality. As strength, they are trained not just to resist action, but to nullify emotional response. Imagine someone yelling in your face, questioning your worth, and you feel nothing but duty. That's not weakness, that's mastery. 3. Ritual as discipline. To the untrained eye, a changing of the guard may look like ceremony. But to the guard, it's a live demonstration of synchronization, muscle memory, and tradition forged through repetition. The same way special forces rehearse room entries until they can do it blindfolded. 4. Silence as a weapon. In many elite military units, silence is golden. It disorients the opponent. It shifts power. Barrett didn't just stand still, he controlled the conversation by saying nothing until it mattered. 5. Code over ego. This might be the most important. Barrett didn't act for applause. He didn't correct Hayes to win an argument. He responded exactly once when protocol was breached. No more, no less. Now here's something the public rarely sees. After the American delegation departed, Captain Wells met with Barrett privately. The conversation, barely a minute long. Wells simply said, "Well handled, Sergeant. You followed the book and you wrote a page they'll study later." Barrett nodded once. That was it. He didn't celebrate, didn't retell the story over drinks, didn't even mention it to his fellow guards, because for men like Barrett, doing the job right is the reward. Meanwhile, word of the incident, despite diplomatic discretion, began to circulate quietly among military channels, not as a scandal, but as a lesson. A reminder that tradition, when wielded with conviction, is not deadweight, but a double-edged sword. One side cuts through ego, the other reinforces the spine. Ready to see how that lesson was put to the test in a way no one expected? The twist is coming. A week after the incident, a short internal memo circulated through the U.S. Marine Corps European Command. It was brief, under 300 words, and marked for internal review only. Its subject: clarification of ceremonial protocol when engaged in Allied military events. Unofficially, it became known among junior officers as the Barrett Clause. Though the memo never named names, everyone understood where it came from. And more importantly, why. Back at Buckingham Palace, life moved on. Tourists came and went. Guards rotated posts. The stone stayed just as pale and regal under London's skies. But inside one of the security briefings held the following week, Captain Wells paused after going through new counter-surveillance routines. He looked at the young guardsmen in training and said, "What happened last week is not a warning. It's a reminder. You're not here to impress. You're here to represent. And sometimes that means letting others lose their composure so you can prove you've mastered yours." Word had gotten around, not just in the UK, but across partner nations. A quiet ripple, officers referencing the moment as a case study. Training academies slipping it into lectures on cross-force cooperation. Because Barrett didn't just respond correctly, he responded precisely. And in doing so, he forced the military world to examine something often overlooked. What does real readiness look like? When the pressure is public, the insult is personal, but the response must be professional. Now, here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. 3 months after the confrontation, a joint NATO training exercise in northern Scotland brought together mixed units: British, American, Canadian, and German forces. Among them, a small security detail assigned to liaise between ground logistics teams and ceremonial safety units. Guess who was on that list? Sergeant William Barrett. And guess who was not there? Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Hayes. In fact, Hayes had requested reassignment back to a U.S.-based advisory role 2 weeks earlier, citing professional divergence in command alignment as the reason. Unofficially, well, let's just say it became clear that not every battlefield requires a bullet. Some are fought with bearing. But here's the twist, and it's one no one saw coming. At the closing of the exercise, a surprise guest arrived, flown in discreetly, there to observe and deliver closing remarks. General Isaac Monroe, the same American general who'd quietly defended Barrett at the palace. He gave a short, powerful speech. Most of it focused on cross-cultural unity, strength in silence, and the changing face of modern military leadership. But toward the end, he paused. There are moments in a soldier's life when you're asked to speak, and others when you're asked to stand. Only the best know when to do each. Then he looked directly at Barrett. One of our finest allies recently taught me that lesson without saying more than a sentence. The crowd, mostly unaware of the full backstory, still erupted in applause, because even without names, message was clear. In a world full of noise, drama, and reaction, discipline is the quietest, most powerful force on the battlefield. And Barrett, the so-called mannequin in red, had become the model of modern military restraint. That's the twist. Hayes came in thinking he'd teach a lesson, But it was he who became the lesson, one that will be told in military halls and briefing rooms for years to come. And Barrett, he didn't smile, didn't react. He just stood there, still, steady, silent, like always. In the days and weeks that followed, people continued to talk about it. Not just officers and soldiers, but diplomats, palace staff, even a few seasoned historians. And what started as a minor diplomatic friction evolved into something far more lasting. A moment that redefined what respect looks like, across uniforms, across borders, and across values. Because the real brilliance of Sergeant Barrett wasn't just in his silence. It was in what that silence represented. Think about it. He didn't resist. He didn't escalate. He didn't try to win the moment. Instead, he stayed rooted in duty, not in pride. And in doing so, he reminded the world that not every challenge requires noise. Sometimes the highest form of strength is restraint under pressure. Let's sit with that. In a time where speed is everything and everyone is pushed to react fast, speak louder, respond sharper, Barrett gave us the opposite: measured stillness, respectful firmness, unshakable purpose, and it struck a chord. Now here's something else to think about. When Hayes issued his demand, "Salute me now," he thought he was enforcing respect. But what he missed entirely is that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, and Barrett, he earned it without raising a hand or voice. Let's rewind to something important. At the beginning of this story, Hayes saw the Royal Guards as decoration. But by the end, even as he refused to admit it, he stood face to face with a soldier whose training, experience, and bearing surpassed every superficial assumption. That's what the Royal Guard is all about. They're not there to entertain. They're there to embody history, embody duty, embody self-control when the whole world is watching. Let me offer a final reflection, something you may not have considered. The British Royal Guard doesn't hold its ground out of stubbornness. It does so because it represents something that must not move: the values, stability, and honor of the crown. Not a person, not a government, but an idea, the idea that some things are sacred. That's why they stand still. And in standing still, they carry more weight than some soldiers do while shouting commands or charging into battle. That's the legacy Barrett upheld that day, not just of the British Army, but of every soldier who's ever served something bigger than themselves. So if you find yourself in a position where your values are tested, where you're being poked, provoked, or pushed to respond, ask yourself, is this about me? Or is this about something greater that I'm protecting? Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is hold your ground. So here we are, at the end of a story that began with a simple demand: salute me now. What unfolded was so much more than a clash of customs. It was a masterclass in restraint, a study in principle, and perhaps above all, a glimpse into what happens when unshakable tradition meets unearned authority and prevails. Let's step back and consider the true reversal in this story, the twist that few noticed on first glance. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes believed he was asserting dominance. Instead, he revealed insecurity. He believed the Royal Guard's silence was submission, but it was sovereignty. He believed he would leave the palace with a lesson taught, but he left having received a lesson he never expected and perhaps still hasn't fully understood. Barrett never moved, but he made a career officer flinch. He never raised his voice, but he silenced a man with 22 years of battlefield command. He never disrespected rank, but he reminded everyone, including his allies, that respect for protocol transcends respect for personality. And here's the part no one expected. Long after the delegation was gone and the media moved on and Hayes disappeared into a quieter desk job, a framed photograph was quietly added to a Royal Guard training hall. No plaque, no fanfare. Just a still shot taken from tourist footage. Barrett standing at post, unflinching, with Lieutenant Colonel Hayes mid-gesture, inches away. Frozen forever in a moment that says more than any textbook ever could. And beneath the photo, a simple inscription: to stand still is not to yield. That, dear friends, is the ethos of the Royal Guard, And that's the kind of soldier the world needs more of, not just in battle, but in boardrooms, on the streets, and in every arena where ego threatens order. Now, as we wrap up today's story, let's give credit where it's due. To the Royal Guard, you are more than ceremony. You are the visible edge of invisible strength, a symbol of stillness under fire, and living proof that composure can, in fact, command a room. You've shown us that tradition, when upheld with discipline and integrity, doesn't weigh us down, it lifts us higher. So the next time you see a soldier in a scarlet tunic standing motionless, don't ask, "Why aren't they doing something?" Ask instead, "What kind of strength does it take to do nothing perfectly for the sake of something bigger?" That's what Sergeant Barrett gave us, and that's what we honor today. If this story moved you, even just a little, we ask you to do 3 simple things. Like this video. Comment below where in the world you're watching from and what you think real military discipline looks like. And subscribe to Royal Guard for more untold stories of service, legacy, and the quiet strength behind the uniforms. Until next time, stand tall, stand firm, and remember to stand still with purpose is sometimes the boldest move of all. See you in the next story.